What's going on, UCC? So here I am again with another sermon, but I first wanted to start off by saying Happy Mother's Day to all the moms out there. I hope the moms are able to duck requests for snacks and demands for play and long-winded stories and endless questions in order to hear this and be with us a little bit. And I'm sure your responsibilities as a mom have only increased in this time, and I praise God for your faithfulness in that and pray He give you patience and strength. But here we are again with another sermon here. And I just wanted to say how hard this is. I mean, it's no one's preference that we have virtual church. And God has made us embodied creatures for a reason. And so much of our formation as individuals and as a community comes from just being together in a room, even before anything gets said or done. But this is what we have. And as I said in my last sermon, I've been so encouraged during this time by reading the letters of the Bible. As more than half of the New Testament is written by leaders who are confined to their location, yet need to speak a word of challenge and encouragement to a church that they care about in a different location. And being in that predicament, they relied on the technological device of the letter. And the letter gave them the ability to overcome the problem of distance to still convey their personal presence and their message to a people that they were separated from. So likewise, here we are, relying on technology, videos and emails and letters and texts to still be with each other the best that we can. And so I encourage you to endure this difficult time by putting forth the extra effort it's taking to engage online. And so with that, I wanted to keep reading from the letter that I read 2 weeks ago. I did 2 Corinthians 1:1-7, and talked about how God gives us comfort in all of our affliction, so that we can comfort others. And I just want to keep reading those next 4 verses to continue on what Paul's saying in 8-11. And I want to note here how Paul experiences despair, but chooses to adopt a redemptive interpretation of that despair and invites the community into that with him. He says, verse 8, this is 2 Corinthians 1, verse 8, "We do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. For we were so utterly and unbearably crushed that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death, so that we would not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. He who rescued us from so deadly a peril will continue to rescue us. And on him we have set our hope that he will rescue us again, as you also join in helping us by your prayers, so that many will give thanks on our behalf for the blessing granted us through the prayers of many." And so here Paul begins to get personal. So up until now, he merely claims that God gives us comfort in affliction. But here he starts to apply that to his personal life. He speaks of a time in Asia when he experienced a specific affliction. And as readers, we'd love to know what that specific cause was. But he seems more concerned with sharing more how that situation made him feel. He's vulnerable about the emotional impact of that affliction he faced, but then also about his hopeful interpretation of that includes the church, his hopeful response that includes them. And so first, let's talk about his excruciating distress. He says, quote, "We were so utterly, unbearably crushed that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death." And so let's work this out. There were plenty of times when the nature of Paul's suffering included physical harm. He tells of being beaten and imprisoned and physically threatened. But here, one scholar says his description is more internal, like a nervous breakdown. Like the load he experienced had become so unbearable, and any energy and strength that could come from within had been totally depleted. Scholar N.T. Wright distinguishes between the physical threats Paul had experienced and the emotional pain he's experiencing now like this. He says, quote, "It's bad enough to hear a magistrate declare you are sentenced to death. It's far worse when a voice deep inside yourself tells you that you might as well give up and die." So that's the point of despair Paul had reached here, where darkness seemed to be caving in and where he felt like he lost control to make it better. And so I want to pause here before going on, because I think we can relate to this kind of affliction. In our culture, it's hard to relate to Christians who have experienced and suffered physical persecution, but we can totally relate to feelings of despair, feeling utterly crushed and wanting to give up. And we feel that even more now in a pandemic. Many of us look around to our surrounding situation, we read the news, and we feel like this situation is unending. We experience fear and despair around our health and the health of loved ones. We We experience a collective grief about what we've lost as a result of this or what we might lose in the future. We experience loss of jobs or salary cuts or the fear that those things would happen. And in the face of all this, we feel the very real absence of control to improve it. So we may experience that chaos and despair. And since it's Mother's Day, I've been thinking about the weight that moms are carrying now. I mean, moms already bear so much to hold their family together and do it all. But this pandemic exacerbates every emotion moms can face and every burden they carry. I mean, now you have to do homeschool. You have to find a way to work from home without childcare while still doing all your mom stuff. And if you still leave the house for work because you're an essential worker, I mean, all the emotional battle you face by being a working mom, that's exacerbated too, all the more when you can't be home with your kids. And all the challenges that normally push moms to their breaking points as moms are increased all the more in this time. And so maybe as a mom, if you just feel totally spent and in over your head and done, and you may relate to Paul's feeling here. And on top of that, perhaps you even get a dose of guilt for feeling that way instead of being more thankful for extra time with the kids. And so all that can be internally excruciating and crushing and put you at the end of your rope and feeling like Paul felt. And this pandemic, it just exacerbates despairing situations that are painful enough otherwise. And I still think with Mother's Day, I mean, I guess I'm thinking of things from this week, Mother's Day brings about so much grief for so many others. If you've lost your mom, or your mom's been physically or mentally ill, or if you've just experienced a broken relationship with your mom that you so deeply long to repair, but it just can't, or if you struggle to get pregnant or have miscarried or have lost a child, you experience too that sense of absence of control, of being utterly crushed, as Paul said. And that grief can be overbearing and relate to Paul here. Or another situation from this week, racism in this country rearing its ugly head in a tragic way again. For those of you who are blessed enough to have been avoiding news for the last several days, another video surfaced of a despicable and fatal act of racism when two white men shot and killed a young innocent black man named Unbearably, who was just jogging around the neighborhood because they said he fit the description of a burglary suspect. The men have been arrested now, but what's further shame is that the authorities possessed that video for months and yet did not arrest him until we all saw the video. This is yet another tragic reflection of the centuries-long racism that has seeped into the collective hearts and systems of our culture that caused another black man's life to be lost. And I cannot imagine the feeling of being utterly crushed in despair that his family must have felt when they got that call, the way his community feel, the way that people who look like him feel, of the anger that they feel. And I know many of us just feel a sense of helplessness, of loss of control, anger, and grief as this deep-seated problem in our culture continues to harm people. We have that feeling of utter despair of all life being lost as Paul experienced. And there's just so many other endless sources of those kinds of feelings Paul's experiencing here that human beings face. Feelings of being utterly crushed and despairing from within. And I can't cover all the sources of that, but I hope I've given enough to relate to that feeling. But now I want to move to see how Paul's response and how the gospel enter into that exact situation and start bringing hope to his heart and to the community. He gives the result of those feelings he experienced. He says he experienced the affliction and the feelings of despair that followed, quote, so that we would rely not on ourselves but on God who raises from the dead. He faithfully declares that the result of his affliction is that he would not rely on himself but on God. That's his redemptive interpretation. Now be careful to observe how easily it will be for untrue theology to creep in here. It's easy for us to believe that God purposefully caused Paul's affliction to happen for the deliberate reason of teaching Paul a lesson. That's not what he's saying, nor what he believes. Paul does not believe everything happened for a reason. Harm is not caused by God, but by sin, Satan, and death. But because of God's resurrection power in the world through the gospel, God can break into any situation and graft it into the resurrection story. So by saying this, Paul is choosing to interpret his suffering through the lens of a story of God raising Jesus from the dead, that God is actively in the world making all things new. And therefore, even the worst news doesn't have to be the last news, but can at any time make a redemptive turn. For if it is true that God himself died in the flesh and was able to overcome the death by being raised from the dead, then any potential despair that we face cannot be the end. And so that applies to anything. God does not cause and order abuse, rape, violence, loss, racism, death, However, he does not cause any of those. However, when those things come by the way of evil's work in the world, God's resurrection power can break into hearts and situations and turn even the worst sins and circumstances, things done to us, things that we've done, towards his purposes. That's the famous line from Romans 8. God works all things together for the good for those who love him, those called according to his purpose. It means his resurrection power and hope is so effective that it can permeate any situation in the world and can turn even the most evil things toward the purposes of the gospel. All can be used towards our transformation, including what we're facing right now. And so Paul's redemptive turn here is that this experience of being utterly crushed can remind him to rely on God who raises the dead instead of relying on himself. And this is a tremendously important reminder for God's desire to transform us. We've never been in control. We have agency, we have choice and freedom, sure, but all of us are tempted to embrace the falsehood that we have more control in our lives and situations than we actually do. And our feelings of despair, like Paul's, are a reminder that it is not true that we have control and that we actually have to rely on God instead. The news that you are not in control is actually terrible news to us who might cling to our autonomy and freedom. But that stripping away of self-reliance turns to good news when relying on ourselves is replaced by relying on God. Why? Because this is a good God who brings dead things to life. It's terrible not having my freedom, but if instead God has control, he raises dead things to life, all is well. Paul then rehearses the story of Christ's resurrection that gives that statement theological backing. He looks backwards, verse 10. He who already rescued us from so deadly a peril. And in that statement, he has in view both Jesus conquering death on the cross, big picture, as well as specific ways from our life story in which God has already broken in to bring deliverance. And then he looks forward saying God will continue to rescue us, and on him we have set our hope that he will rescue us again. He's saying, if God conquered death in Jesus' body and has already delivered us from so deadly a peril previously, then we can count on him to take that deliverance forward and deliver us from death once and for all in the future. So Paul trusts God that his despair can be used in his transformation process by reminding him to rely on God, not himself. And he's able to make this move by first remembering the bigger story of God, that God raised Jesus from the dead. So this leads to an encouragement for us. One of the first ways to persist in choosing this faithful and hopeful interpretation of our despair is by engaging in practices that remind us of the story of God. Paul's mind and heart were soaked with the scriptures. He obsessed over the gospel story, and you can tell, even when he despairs, that his heart is bent towards seeing it through the lens of what he trusts to be true about God. And so I want to encourage us to follow Paul's lead by finding ways to encounter scripture. I realize how daunting it can feel when you're worn out in pain to be told, hey, you should read the Bible more. So I don't encourage this with any kind of pressure or guilt or anything like that. But at the same time, I just speak from my own life of the huge impact that reading the Bible has had. Without the Bible, without scriptures, our story of life is crafted by despairing, limited stories of social media, TV shows, news, and the like. And those small stories close in around us with no hope for our despair. But the scriptures break open those small stories and remind us of who God is and what he's done, what he will do, and how we all are graciously included in. And so I encourage you, if you don't have a regular pattern of reading the Bible, pick the least overbearing practice and do it for a while without any expectation. So maybe you read a chapter a day in the morning or night, or listen to an audio Bible, or listen to a sermon podcast, or listen to the Pray As You Go podcast, or watch some Bible Project videos, or read those devotions I'm sending out in the email, or read with a friend. You pick anything and devote some time to letting that story soak in your mind with no expectations. And when I say no expectations, what I mean is do not self-consciously evaluate how you did or how it felt after each time. Just commit to changing the habit, and in 6 months, look back to reflect on whether it had an impact. So I started reading the Bible more diligently every morning in 2012, and I chose not to care what I got out of it, or even if I remember what I read. All I cared about was making sure I read it. It didn't have any immediate impact on my life. In many days, I was tired and preoccupied, and that's from a guy who was graduating seminary at the time, so it's pretty bad. Yet, though, I just said I'm going to do it. And now, over 8 years later, I can see how my perspective on all things has continued to be shaped by that practice. And I think Paul's perspective was formed by the scriptures too, and that's what enabled him to go there when he experienced suffering. And so I invite us to follow Paul's lead here. It takes some effort, sure, as any positive change in our life does, but God's grace can begin to permeate our hearts and soak in our minds as we embrace what the church has done for millennia, and that is soak in the scriptures. So let's keep going, because I want to see how Paul immediately invites the church into this process through two other millennia-long practices that the church has always done. Verse 11, as you also join in helping us by your prayers, so that many will give thanks on our behalf for the blessing God granted us through the prayers of many. And so he wants the church community to join in his choice to rely on God in two ways. First, they join by praying for him and with him. So by sharing his choice to rely on God in a dark time with others and asking them to pray alongside him, it invites them to automatically share in his choice too. The act of praying is indeed an act of relying on God who raises Jesus from the dead. So prayer relinquishes our freedom and our control to God. Prayer is an active step to receive whatever God has for us. Prayer reflects humble dependence on God. Prayer acknowledges that we do not have the resources within ourselves to overcome our situation and that we need God. So by Paul inviting people to pray with him, he's inviting them to take on his redemptive approach to his own suffering. And imagine what could happen if they do this. Perhaps in the process of praying for his despair, they might end up praying for their own struggles as well, joining Paul in interpreting their despair as an opportunity to rely on God, not themselves. And once they do that, perhaps they'll also join Paul as well in the process of sharing their struggles with others and asking them to pray for and with them too. So then you have a whole community who's individually and collectively choosing to rely on God in the face of despair, choosing to share with others what they've chosen to do this, and asking each other to participate in praying for and with them too. So, and then what can happen when you have a whole community relying on God together through prayer? The second practice. The whole community can then participate in giving thanks when those prayers are answered. His logic is, the more of you that pray for me, the more are prepared to give thanks. If more of you know what I'm longing for and praying for, when our prayers are then answered in any way, I can share that with you, and then we can give collective gratitude. N.T. Wright says that when human beings give thanks to God, something at the heart of the universe comes back into proper shape. Humans thanking the Creator are a symptom of the way the world was meant to be, a sign that one day it really will be like that. So note again, to close, the pattern that Paul leads his readers to participate in. He experiences the same thing all human beings eventually face many times in life, of feeling utterly, unbearably crushed to the point that he despaired of life itself. He chose then to interpret that suffering redemptively, by believing his suffering was not the end and that God could use it toward his purposes of transformation, because God raised Jesus to life and promises to do that for us too, which is the core story we believe in from the Bible. He then asks people to join in on that redemptive turn by shared prayer and shared thanksgiving. And the kind of community formed by this way of life reflects a hope-filled trust in Jesus' death and resurrection in the face of any and all despair. And by such a community existing even to this day, we can invite a despairing world into that hope as well. I love you all. I miss you. I'm praying for you. And I pray you all reach out. If there's anything from this that struck you that's worth talking about, reach out. I love you all to death. I'll see you.